So welcome, Kai and Alice. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Katie.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very excited to talk about Global Forest Watch today.
It's a wonderful platform. I wanted to start off by asking, which is how I ask everybody, what is the problem that we're facing in the world, all the not-for-profits, all the people who are trying to work on forest conservation, if we don't have this type of good quality data and we don't have a platform like what you're working on? What's the problem with having a gap like that?
I think one of the main problems that Global Forest Watch is trying to address is the idea that while there is this wealth of geospatial data, of data in general, there is kind of a dearth of products and methods by which people can access this data. And so Global Forest Watch strives to show data in a visualization that is both simple on the surface level, but also able to be dug into deeper by more technical users. And this is generally important because around the world, we're privileged to have the internet access that we do, the technology that we do. But there are areas of low bandwidth where people struggle to access data and would have a lot of trouble downloading like the terabytes of data that we process and analyze and visualize. Global Forest Watch strives to make that process a lot easier as well, and to make sure that there's kind of a democratic distribution of data availability and generally transparency and open data for anyone who needs to use it for any reason.
I guess one big gap is that without this data, when you think about a forest or really forests everywhere around the world, and you don't have transparency into what's happening, it can be kind of like a black box, right? Because they're so big, they're so complex, and they have so many different species of trees and plants and animals. So it makes it quite challenging to discover potential disturbances within them that could be something like illegal deforestation or fires that might be spreading out of control or illegal clearing for agriculture, something like that. So alternatively, with the data that Global Forest Watch features, we can kind of start to see when and where forest change is occurring, such as fires and deforestation, so that we can know exactly where to investigate, and so that different stakeholders in different kind of contexts, whether they be geographic or different industries, can respond to that disturbance in a timely manner.
And what would be the ultimate mission of the platform? We know it's to help and protect forests, but say if everything was working perfectly in its ultimate incarnation, in its relationship between the data and all of the different groups around the world that are working on this, what would be the utopian ultimate vision of this whole process?
I think the utopian vision is to provide transparency into what's happening to the world's forest to anyone, anywhere, despite their internet bandwidth or any kind of other identifying factor, so that ultimately everyone everywhere is empowered to protect and advocate for forests. And what that would ultimately look like is a halt of illegal deforestation.
Okay, wonderful. I've got a whole bunch of technical questions I want to dive into. So why don't you do the presentation that you had prepared first, and then I'll get into the questions again after that.
So Global Forest Watch offers a suite of tools that visualize the world's forests. And for instance, you can access the map, which is on the right side of the presentation at the moment, to visualize hundreds of different data sets, conduct analyses to measure forest change statistics, and even activate recent satellite imagery to investigate near real-time deforestation. And you can also access the dashboard to understand trends in tree cover loss through interactive and customizable charts. And so you might be wondering how we identify where and when tree cover loss is occurring. So if you were to look at two satellite images of the same area at different periods of time yourself, you might notice some shifts in what that area looks like. So in that first image, you might see an intact forest with trees surrounding the landscape, whereas in the second image, if a disturbance were to have occurred within that forest, you might see a clearing of trees. And the human eye can really easily spot that change when provided the images, but it's challenging to manually find those changes for the entire world. So technology allows us to automate that process and mark when and where any disturbance is taking place. And before getting further into our quick presentation, we wanted to clarify that tree cover loss is not the same as deforestation. Tree cover can refer to trees in plantations as well as natural forests. And tree cover loss is the removal of tree canopy due to human or natural causes, which can include things like fires or agricultural clearing. Next slide, please. So one of the key data sets on our platform is the annual tree cover loss data. And every year when the University of Maryland's GLAD lab, who produced the data, refreshes the annual tree cover loss data, we then run an analysis to determine the state of the world's forests and what occurred throughout that year. So despite the challenge of the tree cover loss data not differentiating between types of loss, contextual data sets and satellite imagery can help us draw more informed conclusions. So in this example, when the 2020 tree cover loss data was released, we used that data to show, we used data that shows boundaries of primary forests and ran a comparison with the 2019 tree cover loss findings to determine that primary rainforest destruction had increased by 12%. And this finding is particularly significant and disconcerting because primary forests are generally undisturbed by human activity. They're among the most biodiverse forests, providing a range of ecosystem services that are really, really critical to how we live. Next slide, please. Another key offering that we have on the platform is the deforestation alerts that are available for the tropics. Knowing when and where deforestation is happening as soon as possible is crucial to stopping it, and the available alert systems allow for just that. Alerts update on a near real-time basis as pink pixels, allowing you to easily spot areas of likely deforestation, and you can even sign up to be notified when an alert appears in an area that you're interested in monitoring. And this information is intended to provide an early indication of where new deforestation may be occurring, acting as kind of a starting point for further investigation. So for instance, this GIF shows a buffer zone by a national park in Peru, and you can watch as the pink pixels form a line across the satellite image, indicating the expansion of a logging road being built into that area. I'll provide a real-life story of what this data looks like in action later on, but first I'll pass it to Kai to talk us through the satellite systems and how we get to a pink pixel on the map.
All right, thank you so much, Alice. I would now like to take you through an introduction to the technical side of forest monitoring. I will walk us through the journey data takes from the satellite all the way to the maps on Global Forest Watch. So first, I think it's important to cover the different types of satellite systems that are available for use for forest monitoring and the ones that we specifically use for our data sets. When talking about satellite systems, we typically break them up into two different groups, so passive sensors and active sensors. A passive sensor is a microwave instrument designed to receive and to measure different parts of the Earth's surface and its atmosphere. In the case of Landsat and other optical sensors, reflected light is sensed in order to detect electromagnetic energy on the Earth's surface. This is essentially what a regular camera does to capture images, but passive sensors like Landsat can actually pick up more types of light than just the visible spectrum. This enables us to learn more about what's happening on the Earth's surface than the human eye can detect. One really cool example of this is the way that the healthy vegetation on Earth reflects infrared light. While humans can't see infrared light, satellites like Landsat can. In infrared photography, vegetation appears extremely bright, standing out against other types of land cover. This is called the red edge, and it enables us to monitor plant activity from space. So the second category of satellite systems are active sensors. These sensors create their own signal, sending pulses of light down to the surface of the Earth and collecting information about surface characteristics based on how the light is reflected back. With radar sensors, microwave radiation is the signal sent by the satellite. With LiDAR sensors, a laser is transmitted. Active sensors, unlike passive sensors, can penetrate cloud cover, which is very useful in areas like the tropics where we monitor forests and where clouds can obstruct our view. So I will now move to the next slide and go over some image processing steps. So this methodology is meant to basically prepare the thousands of different Landsat images that exist and are processed by the satellite into an analysis-ready data set. So a data set that we can then use in the variety of algorithms that we run to create our final data products. And just to be specific, when I say we, I'm talking about our partners at the University of Maryland, and they are the ones who developed this initial process. So initially, we do a quality assessment. An image is assigned an observation quality based on how clear the image is of effects like cloud cover, cloud shadow, haze, and other atmospheric conditions. Images may not be usable if there are too many instances of shadows or clouds disrupting our view of the forest. So the next step is to remove the clouds, the cloud shadows, the haze on pixels on a pixel by pixel basis. And then the next step would be to correct the data to match surface reflection. So this is interesting because Landsat images are acquired from slightly different angles. This process corrects for this and makes sure all images are visually consistent. This is vital because we are trying to detect very subtle surface changes. And so any inconsistency in color or lighting could kind of throw a wrench in this process. So the next step is to create 16-day composites of the data. So this enables us to compile a data set with only the highest quality observations. So once this process is complete, we now have a data set that is ready for analysis and ready to be transformed into a data product shown on Global Forest Watch. So next up, I know this is a lot, but I will walk through it and hopefully help you understand the process that we take to create such a data set. In this example, I'm going to use the GLAD alerts that Alice talked about earlier. And just to be specific, GLAD alerts are called that because of the lab at University of Maryland, not necessarily because we're glad that they're happening. We aren't. So let's go through this. So the primary purpose of the GLAD alert system, of course, is to provide an early indication of where new deforestation may be occurring so that law enforcement officers, local communities, advocacy organizations, and other responders can take targeted action. GLAD alerts are a starting point for future and further investigation. They pinpoint where deforestation may be happening so that then users can follow up. So this GLAD alert system devised by the University of Maryland uses satellite imagery from Landsat to collect weekly data on deforestation across the tropics. The entire system is run within Google Earth Engine. Each GLAD alert indicates a 30 by 30 meter area, which is around the size of 2 basketball courts, that has experienced a disturbance in the forest canopy, which indicates that trees in that area may have been lost or removed. So the very first step in the process of developing an alert system like this is to define the term alert. In this case, an alert is triggered based on a single observation of tree cover loss within a 30 by 30 meter Landsat pixel. Tree cover loss within a pixel is determined to have happened if there was more than a 50% decrease in the forest within the pixel compared to the previous observation. So in this method, the latest Landsat image is downloaded, all pixels are assessed for quality and undergo image processing as described in the previous slide. So the next step is that processed data is input into an algorithm for flagging forest disturbance. The algorithm compares the latest image with the previous images from the same area, and then loss is determined using a classification tree algorithm. So this is complicated, but I will go into just the basics about what this is. So a classification tree algorithm, also known as decision trees, are predictive modeling tools that split up a data set in different ways based on different conditions. In this case, the algorithm is splitting up data into either forest disturbance or no forest disturbance. Finally, the results of this analysis are further categorized into possible alert and confirmed alert. This is important. So if a pixel shows loss only once over 4 observations of the area, then it is only a possible alert. The alert actually becomes a confirmed alert. So an alert with higher confidence that we can be maybe more sure that has occurred happens if a loss has occurred twice or more over 4 observations of the area. So now that we've taken a deep dive into one of the methodologies that we use to create our near real-time deforestation alert data, let's talk about how we go from complex data sets to something that is easily visualized on a map or on data visualizations like the graph and chart that you see here. So I think these are really useful because maps and charts really help us make sense of these big numbers. So there are 2 sides to this process: technical implementation and user research. On the technical side, it is very difficult to visualize such huge global data sets. We use a variety of methods to make sure our site runs as efficiently as possible and works for users who are in low bandwidth regions. One example of how we do this is how we visualize tree cover data on the Global Forest Watch map. The map data is broken into smaller parts called tile caches. This data type allows the map to perform much faster when panning and zooming. Our GFW API is how we bring data sets into our dashboard, which contains graphs and charts. We pre-calculate statistics like tree cover loss for each country in the world. Then our API fetches this data when it's requested by the specific data visualization. So as I was saying, the other side of this is making sure that we design our data sets and visualizations to be as clear and easy to understand for a broad audience. This requires a lot of work and a lot of research. We have designed our map to be easily interpreted at a glance. However, for more technical users, there are layers of complexity that they can access. Examples of this include data filters, which enable users to select a specific time range for a data set or a specific subset of the data. Also, we engage in user testing and interviews to improve these components of our site. These user testing sessions can inform everything from the phrasing of information on our site to the colors that we choose for the map data. And now I will pass it on to Alice to share some brief examples of how Global Forest Watch is implemented by our users.
Thanks so much, Kai. So now that Kai's kind of talked us through how we get to that easy to use visualized data and the charts, I'm going to talk through an example really of how it's been used by one of our partners, and then kind of try to demonstrate the actual impact of these tools. So one real life example takes us to Cameroon, where the organization SILD is working to monitor and protect the Deng Deng National Park. SILD used Global Forest Watch to document extensive forest loss caused by flooding from a hydroelectric dam. And they ended up publishing a documentary on their project, as well as training 8 community observers and 6 journalists to utilize Global Forest Watch as a monitoring and reporting tool. And their advocacy work about the environmental and social pressures of the dam prompted a public response from that company that oversees the dam. If we zoom out from a broader level, Global Forest Watch, sorry, Kai, go back, please. Thank you. So if we zoom out from a broader level, Global Forest Watch helps local organizations like SILD, as well as other entities, integrate the data and tools into their monitoring work through a range of engagement tactics. For instance, we form partnerships with universities to innovate upon available forest-related data. We work alongside governments to create national monitoring systems that blend the data on Global Forest Watch with their country's national data. We help private companies better monitor deforestation risk across their supply chains. We provide grants to civil society organizations working to protect forests across the tropics. And we help journalists investigate things like the causes and impacts of forest fires. And the feedback and insight that these partners provide really help us better design the tools for them, like Kai mentioned. Next slide, please. So we've had anecdotal evidence for years that improved data transparency is vital for reducing deforestation, such as the story from SILD. But more recently, we led an impact assessment that lends empirical evidence to that claim. So a study published in early 2021, so this year, investigated the rates of deforestation in regions of Central Africa where forests were being actively monitored with satellite data. And that study found that active monitoring lowered deforestation by 18%. This finding provides evidence for the theory that when forest monitors and decision makers have access to credible, timely information about forest change, they're better able to intervene to prevent further deforestation. Next slide, please. So one of our biggest challenges in the environmental field is that we have so little time and so much to do. And that's why the data we feature on our tools are so crucial, because they help these different kinds of stakeholders determine where to focus their time so that they can achieve the maximum impact. And if you're interested in learning more about Global Forest Watch, you can go to our website, which is up on the screen. And I put it in the chat box as well. But that is the presentation. Katie, we're excited to answer your questions.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. It's an amazing platform. And I would encourage everybody to just jump onto the website. Is it globalforestwatch.com or .org? And just play around with it and start looking at the charts, looking at the data. It's really beautifully done. And in a world where a lot of environmental software is not done very well, it really stands out as just really having excellent attention to detail. Now, you've already, I think, answered most of my questions in the presentation, but just to sort of start diving in, you went through the satellites, the different type of satellites, Kai. I was curious to know that you're partnering with Planet that takes more or slightly lower resolution images every second day. And then you've got the Landsat, which is from NASA. And then there's multiple other private satellite companies. What made you use Landsat? And what's the difference between the Planet Labs data and the Landsat?
Yes, those are great questions. So yes, we use a variety of satellite data, and Landsat has traditionally been what people use to monitor any phenomena that's occurring on land. And this is because it has a relatively fast return period, which is the time that it takes to return to the same spot on the Earth as they've already covered. So it'd be like a 16-day return interval there. So this really allows us to get really frequent images. One thing about Landsat is that it's a mid-range satellite, so it kind of picks up 30 by 30 meter pixels, which is what we would consider not the highest resolution. However, Planet, like you mentioned earlier, is one of the highest resolution satellite imagery. One of the highest satellites that we can get. So they're about a 5 meter resolution, which is really impressive. You can see almost individual trees at that point, which is really remarkable. One thing about Landsat that maybe makes it easier to access than Planet is that it's completely free. So Planet is a proprietary satellite system, and they often charge for access to their complete data sets. The reason why we're able to access it on our site is because of a grant that's enabling us to access monthly mosaics, so monthly data sets on our site. So we're really privileged to have that, but it is something that a lot of users and a lot of people who are doing this kind of research don't necessarily have access to.
And could you talk a little bit through the different bands of the electromagnetic spectrum in some more detail about how this can get used for different forest indicators? You can look up NDVI. There's another one called, is it EMI? I should have looked it up before I asked the questions. Another one that's like an ecological index. You've got the infrared end of the spectrum. And there's so much insight into that band. You have to extract particular slithers of it that indicate forests. Can you go into that in a bit more detail?
Yes, that's a great question. So yes, as you were saying, there are a variety of different electromagnetic waves that we can detect using satellites that we aren't necessarily able to detect using the human eye. So regions of the electromagnetic spectrum that includes are infrared, like I talked about before. And I don't know if I'm an expert on the electromagnetic spectrum, but I'll try to kind of go into more detail about how some of these different statistics like NDVI are calculated. So basically, the electromagnetic spectrum is a visible color spectrum and then non-visible. So the non-visible, as I was talking about, includes the red edge, which allows us to pick up really bright pulses to healthy vegetation. So that's one of the ways that we are able to implement this feature of different satellites. Other satellites that are able to send pulses to the Earth in return are really unique because they allow us to kind of overcome some of the issues with traditional optical sensors. So these are especially interesting because not only can they penetrate cloud cover, but they can also actually ping off of different vegetation constructs. So they can actually look at tree cover height, for example, tree canopy density, things like that, that we were never able to get with optical sensors. So I think when thinking about satellites and the kind of upcoming technology that's really fascinating, that's really where we're trying to go to get a full profile of the forests and the vegetation that we're looking at.
Right, because I actually didn't know that you could get LiDAR from space. I thought it could only be done through aircraft. So one thing that I know is a problem with using NDVI, which is, if anyone doesn't know what that is, that's kind of the density of greenery, like the density of chlorophyll kind of in a pixel, that if you had a really lush football field, it would come up as probably a similar NDVI to a rainforest, right? But if you can use the LiDAR to get a sense of like the canopy cover or get some sort of algorithmic interpretation of the shape of the top of the trees, then you can put the two figures together and you would very easily be able to indicate what's a football field and what's a rainforest, right? Is that kind of what you do?
Yes, so it helps give us this extra contextual information that we didn't have with just optical satellites. And it helps us actually understand some metrics that we've never been able to access before. One of the metrics about forests that are actually really hard to detect is forest gain. And this is particularly complicated because different types of forests grow at different rates. There are different types of forests that will rotate. So for example, a lot of agricultural plantations will grow for a certain period of time and then be cut down and then grow again. And so that would be picked up as gain, even though it's not really the kind of gain that we're after. So with different satellite systems like LiDAR and radar, we're able to kind of get additional contextual information that helps us kind of understand better if the forests we're looking at are truly gaining, or if we're looking at possibly our agricultural forests or other types of forest. So it really helps us identify and get right to the heart of some of the questions that we want to have answers for.
Right, that's fascinating. We've got a question here from Spencer Lindsay. Would you like to come on, unmute yourself and ask your question, Spencer?
I've never used the little hand thing before. It's like,
no, everyone has to use the hand thing because I can't tell the difference between people's general comments and if it's a question or not. So you have to put the hand up to get to ask a question. Anyway, so
okay,
go on, Spencer.
Two really quick questions. One is 5 meter free Landsat data. What? That's a thing? I didn't realize that it was free for at 5 meters. That's amazing.
Sorry, just to correct that, it's actually the planet imagery that has that level, and it's not necessarily free, but the reason why we're able to access it for free is because of like a generous donation.
Right, because we use 30 meter and I'd love to find 5 meter. But the other one was when you're sampling, when you're trying to get your cloud cover and shadow data, when you're trying to pull that data out from underneath the cover and the shadow, how do you do that? Because you're going to add to the data by removing the shadow or the cloud, right? Like is it from the surrounding pixels or?
That is a really good question. I think that the University of Maryland researchers might be better equipped to answer that specific question, but I can speak more generally about the methods for putting together these analysis-ready data sets. So in some cases, it's true that images are completely obscured by clouds, and there's not much we can do about that. But one reason why the analysis-ready data sets include a 16-day composite is because one single pixel might have like 16 different versions of that area. So you can choose like the best images from each picture. So hopefully using that method, you can kind of fill in the spaces over time that you weren't able to see from a previous image. So that's one of the methods that one could use to make kind of higher quality data.
Thank you.
And Spencer, I think you can, sorry, Alice. Well, I'll just finish what I was just going to say. Spencer, I think if you go to Google Earth Engine and you can get NAPE data, which is the flyover data that's done by the American Geological Society. They do quite high resolution of, it's not the world's forests, but it can be of cities, because I've done a bit of work on trying to work out the green cover of just urban areas where you need really, really high resolution. You need to identify like a single tree. You can actually get that for free from that government flyover that's done, I think like once a year or something.
The name of it again? I
think it's called NAIP, N-A-I-P. Or if you look up American Geological Graphical, I can't remember the exact, it's American Geographical Association, or maybe somebody else knows exactly what it is, but, or it's the US Agricultural Department or something. Anyway, some government department flies a plane over all the American cities once a year and gets it, and you can get it for free.
Okay, awesome. I will search. Thank you.
Sorry, Alice,
no worries now. No worries at all. I just wanted to add regarding the planet imagery. So it is available on our map for free, but it cannot be downloaded from our map. However, through Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, or NICFI, anyone can really access the high resolution mosaics as long as they're working to reduce and reverse the loss of tropical forests and combat climate change and that kind of work. So if you want to learn more about that initiative and see if you're qualified to gain access to that data, you can go to planet.com/NICFI, so NICFI, and I'll share that link in the chat in case you're interested.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Sarah. I can't remember whether it's Amen or Amen, sorry.
That is okay. So super interesting stuff that you guys are doing. Like, this is awesome. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. I had two questions. One of them was, have you guys heard of or maybe worked with any institutions who are using this platform as like an interpretive tool, like zoos or museums or anything? Like, it seems like it's almost a ready-made interpretive exhibit for people to start exploring this type of data.
That's a great question. I can give one example of a group that we've worked with, the Oregon Zoo in particular. So we worked with them to create a map interactive for their Where Do Primates Live exhibit. And we worked really closely with them on how to design that map and how to represent the data on their kind of in-person interactive.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Otherwise, oh, sorry. I was just going to add, otherwise, we've seen some artists create some kind of artistic installations using the data. And I believe one of them even kind of translated the pixels into vibrations to kind of physically show the change that was happening over time within their respective region.
It's a really exciting concept to think about how you could use all these maps and all these charts and all this data to take it to the next creative level of like how to educate people and use immersive experiences. And there's always quite a few designers and artists in this group, so maybe it will sort of pick off some ideas.
Yeah, I love to see how people can use that data creatively to create art and to interpret exhibits and information. So that's cool. Thank you for those examples. My second question was, of course, working at an aquarium, I'm like, okay, how do we apply this information for aquatic life? Have you guys seen anything similar to this that addresses like kelp forest or coral reefs? I know it's much harder to have this kind of information because, of course, it's under the water, so it makes it difficult for satellite imagery, but I'm curious to know if you've ever heard anything like this being done for aquatic habitats.
So I think this month, actually, the World Resources Institute, which Global Forest Watch is housed in, is going to launch something called Ocean Watch, which will kind of deliver science to policymakers developing sustainable ocean economies and kind of thinking through integrated ocean management. I'm not an expert in exactly what that will look like, but you can learn more through that link I just shared. And just for auditory reasons, it's WRI/initiative/ocean-watch.
There is another really interesting project that is called Global Fishing Watch that was done with the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, or funded by them, and a group called a satellite processing group called, I think they're called Skywatch. And they did something, it was to do with fishing boats though. It was tracking all the fishing boats using satellite data. But it's just technically really interesting to look at what they did on the website.
Yeah, and just to plug another one of our partners too, Global Mangrove Watch is a really good resource for information on mangrove forests. So that's something that you might want to look into as well.
Oh, cool. My next question is about the data size. Now, sorry, somebody has unmuted themselves and is giving a bit of feedback. I can't do it. I can't seem to mute because I lost my host. So Kai, the host, would you be able to mute Claudia?
I am muted.
Yes, let me take a look. I can also make you host again for some reason. Okay, I believe I have muted her successfully.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that, everybody. So in terms of the data size, so I've been working on an urban heat island project, getting NASA's two different types of NASA satellite data, one that's from a sensor that's on the space station and combining it with Landsat data. And the only way to do that is to sit there and look through each image individually and do a search and then download them through their App Ears website, which takes like a couple of hours to find each single one. And then some of these images can be really big in terms of like the gigabytes. What is the like process, like the pipeline of process? Are there like 30 people that just sit there like looking through like all of this? Because forests are big, right? You're talking about really large surface areas. Are there just people that every day just like look one after another and just like scan them and manually do it and then process them? So I just wonder if you could talk to that workflow and like does it require like a lot of servers to just calculate everything all the time and process it and to turn it into something that is like a raster file that you can upload to Mapbox?
Yes, that's a great question. So initially, people would try to identify using kind of manual techniques, the training data set for these algorithms. So experts wanted to compile a data set that really clearly showed areas of loss in areas of forest. But then after these training data sets were compiled, we were able to create algorithms using machine learning. So those bag tree classification methods that I talked about earlier. And so once kind of this manual work has been done, you can train an algorithm to actually detect areas of loss and areas of tree cover, so that huge manual effort doesn't have to happen each time, because that would be really time consuming and really limiting to the types of data sets we could create. And then to answer your question about how we process all of this data, so we use Google Earth Engine primarily, and we also take advantage of cloud computing, which really enables us to take the pressure off of our personal servers.
And so could you access the Landsat images directly through the Google Earth engine? Because if you have to go to the NASA website and download it, it's kind of a bit of a process to go through, right? But I know that the Google Earth engine already has a lot of those data sets all populated within it. So you do the entire thing via the Earth engine UI?
Exactly. So Landsat has a giant Earth Engine data catalog. They have all of the Landsat data back since Landsat 4, and I believe they keep updating it every time there's new data. So that is such a great resource for anyone who's doing this kind of research.
Right, so you can go through there, write different algorithms to process it and capture it, but then you've got to get it onto Mapbox, right? Because you're primarily using so do you have to go in and just like download, is it raster tiles, or is it, what sort of data set is it in terms of like the Mapbox is showing?
Yes, so this is another question that I think our software developers might be able to answer in more detail. But to discuss that in more detail, like that I can provide, we use tile caches. So this very conceptually breaks up these data sets into smaller map tiles, and then it allows us to just query and pull in those tiles when people are looking at a map. So if they're zooming in, we're not loading the entire data set for the world at that resolution. We're just loading the tiles that they want to look at. So it really helps the processing speed along, and it really prevents our site from lagging, especially in areas of low bandwidth.
Right. But you still have to go from the Google Earth engine and then sort of like download that data and then go into your Mapbox map and then upload. There must be somebody who's like constantly doing that, or is it automated? Is there some way to like build a driver that goes between the two softwares?
Yes, I know it's not in a manual process. I can't really speak into more detail about how that transfer works, but I'd be happy to follow up with some additional information once I get that from our software developers.
Right, cool. We've got a question here from David Goodman. Would you like to unmute?
Oh, am I unmuted now?
You are, sorry.
Okay,
Go ahead.
You mentioned that you were using did you say it was a random forest model for deciding if there's a alert should be fired or not based on the image data? I was curious how the training data for that is collected and generated.
Yes, that is a good question. I actually have some notes on that because I anticipated that. So let me pull up my notes on that so I can give you some kind of more in-depth information on that. So the training data is compiled from Landsat. I believe there were 1,500 initial training data sets that were collected. And then the team at UMD worked really closely with forestry experts to manually look at these images and to classify them as either loss of forest or presence of forest. And then using that algorithm, they were able to get it to be more and more accurate. And then once the algorithm kind of fit into their standard accuracy models, they were able to then run the additional Landsat images there and create the data sets that we use today. So it's very general. I would be happy to share some of the scientific papers that have been published on that go into like way more detail than I can.
Cool, thank you. I'm also just very curious how much of the world, I guess, needed to be manually labeled before something general could be created.
Yes, so That is a good question. So for some of the data sets, they ran pilots in specific countries. I believe the countries were Peru, Indonesia, and possibly a country in Central West Africa. And this was because those areas kind of generalize the forest types in those specific continents. So once you could generalize, say, forest patterns that took place in Peru, you could generally speak about forests in the surrounding countries, and then kind of similar process for the other continents. So yes, it would be a huge undertaking to try to do that for every single country or every single individual forest. And so that's why we kind of stick to those specific areas and then kind of work out from there.
Cool, thank you.
Because it's a really fascinating challenge to think about how humanity, if we'll ever get there, the complete streamlined real-time satellite to UI interface, as well as alert process, that it's coming from the satellite, it's moving down to a server. The server is automatically processing that data and filtering out the stuff that we don't want, like cloud cover, and then automatically updating that to any of the, like the Mapbox or the browser UI, and then also sending out emails and text messages whenever there's a significant change that we need to act on. How far away do you think are we, or all of the various like components who work on this? You've got the remote sensing satellite people, and then there's the sort of like the back end engine processing people, and then there's people trying to build like sort of front end interfaces like what Global Forest Watch is doing. How close are we to making the entire real-time pipeline work for the entire Earth?
So this isn't necessarily for the entire Earth at this point, but I would say that the GLAD alerts for the tropical region are getting really, really close to that kind of instantaneous update. So anytime we get a new GLAD alert or a new data set with GLAD alerts in it, we're able to automatically append those to the data sets that are already on Global Forest Watch. And then our UI is actually able to highlight the most recent alerts for the past couple of weeks so that we can help our users identify those areas of change. I think given the nature of forest ecology around the world, it's definitely a lot harder to do this kind of work for boreal forests and other types of forests that have different dynamics than tropical forests. So I think there is a lot more research and time that has to go into characterizing and creating algorithms and classification methods for those types of forests.
And with the GLAD alert, is that like a text message or an email? Like, is it that much down that it goes from satellite, the algorithm processes it, it can tell that there's a substantial difference, and then it just sends a text message to somebody? Is that how they get to know about it?
Yes, so our users can sign up for text alerts or email alerts in a specific area of interest. So for example, a forest ranger might select a specific protected area as their area of interest. And then whenever a GLAD alert is detected there, then they're notified via text or via email. Sometimes if they're using one of our applications like Forest Watcher, which is a mobile application, they can get it via that way too.
Right, and that can be fire or deforestation as well. So any kind of change that's been going on. I suppose a flood would probably come up as an alert as well, because that would change the nature of the forest.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think Alice also talked about a little bit earlier, was that with these types of alerts and deforestation data sets, we are not at the level where we can really determine exactly the drivers of deforestation. There are a lot of different drivers that occur for tree cover loss, but deforestation specifically is when a natural forest or primary forest is converted to a different land use type. So we would see maybe natural forces like floods or fires do this. And we would also see maybe agricultural plantations do this in the same way. So you could get a better idea of this by maybe using our website and looking at the planet imagery for that specific region. The planet imagery could give you a lot better of an idea of what's happening on the ground. And in fact, if you zoomed into that area, you might see plantations like moving into an area of primary forest, or you might see like burn scars from a fire. So that would really help get that contextual information that the GLAD alerts alone wouldn't provide, or the deforestation data set wouldn't necessarily provide.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in addition to the deforestation alerts, we also offer some other data sets from different partners. So we have Beers fire alerts from NASA, for instance, which show in near real time where forests are happening. And that's for global forests. It's not just the tropics. So we have some additional data in addition to those deforestation alerts that can help you start to understand what might be happening within specific regions, as well as contextual data sets like agricultural concessions data. So for instance, where a palm oil plantation might be. That can help you kind of understand, like, okay, if this is happening within that area, perhaps this is related to that kind of agricultural process. Whereas if it is happening within a protected area or primary forest, that might be of greater concern.
Such a good point. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go on. Yeah, keep.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add on to what Alice was saying. Yes, so we do have these contextual data sets that help us understand these patterns of loss that we see. And that's one thing that we've actually built into a lot of our analyses that are on the dashboard. So there's ways to filter loss based on whether it's taking place in a protected area or an agricultural concession like Alice was talking about. And then you can look more precisely at what kind of loss you're interested in. So if you wanted to see just loss that was happening in primary forests to get more at that question of deforestation, you could. If you wanted to get at how much forest is being lost within different plantations, you could also do that based on the filtration options that you choose. So that's something that we thought about for our users and have developed and spent a lot of time working on.
Right, because I was surprised when I looked at I was just looking through it this morning before our call, and it divides up the forest loss by mainly like 4 different types, which is fires, agriculture, forestry, and this other thing called commodity-driven deforestation, which I don't know what it is. But I was surprised that fires are the same as agriculture and also the same as forestry. So the mapping of fires or being able to find fires and get rid of fires. I don't know if it's possible if a fire starts going in a forest, if anybody can do anything about it, to see that. Just to see the scale of how big each one of those sort of 4 main types of forests are. And they must have different types of organizations working on them. Like if you're a fire organization, you're an agricultural sustainability organization, or you're dealing with deforestation. And these must be different organizations that are looking at the different types of actions they need to take in regards to that kind of deforestation, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned commodity-driven deforestation, and this is actually really, really prominent and one of the major drivers of deforestation in the rainforest. So just to help people understand what we are talking about when we're talking about commodities, because it is such an important area of loss, is like cattle, oil palm, soy, cocoa, rubber, coffee, and wood fiber. So these are one of the biggest drivers of loss, and one of the areas where I think there are a lot of those specific groups who are trying to combat that, like you were talking about. So Global Forest Watch has done a lot of work into creating tools for specific markets and specific users. So one way that we've tried to help people who are interested in preventing illegal deforestation in their supply chain or understanding how their product is contributing to deforestation in the tropical rainforests is through Global Forest Watch Pro. And this is a kind of micro site that enables specific users like financiers or different types of consultants for environmental protection and sustainability enter their specific areas of interest. So for example, maybe the specific concessions that they use to source their palm oil. And then they can overlay that with tree cover loss or GLAD alerts and really get at that question of how they're impacting deforestation in global areas. And so that's something that we've worked hard on. And I think that we are moving closer to getting more sophisticated at.
Oh, fascinating. We've got Belinda here who's had her hand up for a while. So Belinda, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. I was wondering if there's any plans to have meteorologists and have this information be disseminated on the news and the weather channels or anything like that. It seems like that would be a good way in the future to make people more kind of aware of the whole issue. People who watch the news.
I love that idea. Go ahead, Alice. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I love that idea too. I haven't heard that come up, but I do know every year when the University of Maryland refreshes the annual tree cover loss data and we run those kind of analyses to pull out insights of what happened, we do get a lot of press attention on those statistics, kind of looking at globally what happened and then zooming into different countries and what happened within each country and what kind of policies might be applicable to whatever trend may have come up. Like we've had a lot of press in the New York Times, Reuters, and various other kind of local news organizations as well. But Kai, I'm curious if you've heard anything about plans of integrating it into kind of meteorologist work.
Yeah. The reason I think meteorologists are a very trusted group of people to a lot of people that watch the news with the weather. And I think it just could be a really good reach to have them on board. I think they're getting on board slowly with the climate more now too.
Yeah. So one thing I totally agree. I think that's such a great idea, just to say that again and reiterate. I think it would be great if there was like a news channel specifically for like deforestation, things like that. But one way that we work really closely with journalists is through this algorithm that actually our research team came up with called Places to Watch. So this algorithm actually prioritizes all of the GLAD alerts that happen on a monthly basis. So even on a monthly scale, there are just so many GLAD alerts, and it's really hard to know what areas are really the most interesting to look at or the most dire in terms of deforestation. And so what this algorithm does is look at the highest concentration of alerts within protected areas like national parks and within areas like primary forest and intact forest. And then we're able to rank areas from 1 to 10 for each continent. And then we pass this information off to some of our specific area researchers within Global Forest Watch so they can kind of guess as to what might be driving this. And they confirm using satellite imagery and confirm using contacts within the country. And then we bundle all this information together and send it out to our partners at Mongabay, who then send out in-person field researchers and journalists to look into this further. So it's a much slower process than what you're suggesting, but it is one way that we have tried to work with media organizations and journalists to get the word out there and to focus on the really, really dire and pressing events of deforestation around the world.
It's a great idea, though. It's a great idea. And I thought of it before with my work on energy lollipop. If I do this, I co-created this little Chrome exception that shows the real-time emissions of the electricity grid. Usually the electricity grid is communicating in kilowatt hours, but if you communicate it in CO2 emissions, it's much more interesting and insightful. And I thought, this should be something that's on the news. It should be like, well, carbon's particularly high right now because it's changing just as much as the weather changes. And it changes actually as a direct proportion to the weather because people's heating and cooling, etc. So there's no reason why the weather report can't have a couple of environmental indicators. Like this is the carbon emissions that are happening right now at 6 p.m. and this is how forest loss, although forests move a little bit slower than carbon emissions. But maybe we should all get together and hit up the Weather Channel to have a little 1 minute little eco report.
Yeah, and I guess one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the deforestation alerts is that they're really meant to act as an indication of what might be happening. So they're designed to kind of be purposely conservative and prioritize speed over accuracy, which might make it hard to feed into something that's sharing that kind of real-time news, because it is really meant to be an indication for further investigation. And like Kai said, sometimes with the partnerships we formed, that investigation can be a bit of a slower process.
Well, that's another one of my questions. I was looking through the website through different countries, and I realized that different countries have different forest assets and different rates of loss. And we hear about palm oil and we hear about the Amazon, but which are the hotspots in the world? Which you're both looking at the data a lot. What are the parts of the world where it's happening a lot that we need to be worried about?
Sorry, I'm muted. So yes, so there are some main hotspots for each of those specific commodities that we talked about. So one of the biggest conversions of forests that we're seeing are from forest to cattle pastures. And this happens most frequently in South America and most highly in Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia, Bolivia, and Argentina. So these areas we know are specifically at risk for deforestation due to the beef and cattle industry. There are other places, like, for example, in West Africa, Central Africa, where cocoa is actually one of the bigger problems because cocoa thrives in those regions. And so one of the difficulties with really understanding where all this deforestation is taking place and what the hotspots are kind of in thinking about like supply chains. So understanding where supply chains are targeting and for certain specific resources, then we can kind of see which areas are most at risk for deforestation. And the data also kind of backs that up. So if you look at where the supply chain sources are coming from, you can kind of see that those are also the areas that are losing most forests due to these different commodities.
So cutting down forests for beef cattle really is like a big deal. You see things on Instagram and you never know, like people say it all the time, but sometimes when you actually ask people who do the data, you get a different story.
Yeah, so I think so. So to be more specific on that, the conversion of forest to cattle is actually 5 times more of an issue than any other analyzed commodity. So that's 5 times more than oil, palm, soy, cocoa, and coffee combined. So it is one of the biggest issues.
Right. What about forest for wood? Do people cut down forest for wood as much?
That is a good question. So yes, that does take place. I think that one of the biggest problems when cutting down wood is looking at kind of the more wood species like rosewood, things that are more valuable. And those are removed from areas of rainforest like Cambodia, Thailand, that region. And so logging is one of the drivers of deforestation, but it's definitely not one of the most prominent on a global scale.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Chris has his hand up. Chris, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about the potential upcoming hotspot to follow on with Katie's question about where the most important things are. And the country of Indonesia is about to move its capital of Jakarta over to incredible wild, diverse land on the island of Borneo to East Kalimantan. And so that's just the fact on the ground is they have to move Jakarta because it's sinking and it's overpopulated and so forth. But the particular thing I'm interested in as well is in regard to what you mentioned about palm oil and being able to tell the difference between a diverse canopy and a industrial canopy, is anything possibly being done, never know how advanced technology is getting, to indicate the health of the species that are among that canopy, either the wildlife corridors that could be created or even anything that indicates, okay, this is the kind of place where, for example, orangutans could live or not. Thank you. I hope that's a reasonably concise question.
Certainly. So yes, we have a lot of partners such as BirdLife International, IUCN, and others who very carefully map the distribution of species. We have specific data sets available on our site. So some of these include the biodiversity hotspots, the rare bird life layer that shows areas of specifically vulnerable bird species. We also show biodiversity hotspots, which are regions that our partners have identified as being most ecologically vulnerable and extremely ecologically rich. So there are a lot of data sets and a lot of researchers who are tackling this problem. And when used in concert with the deforestation data can yield like some really interesting results and insights.
Wonderful answer. Thank you. And I hope that you'll be in touch with the government of Indonesia about protecting Borneo. Thank you.
Can you infer ecological density through remote sensing at all, apart from kind of like the shape and the density of trees? Like you don't really know how many animals are living in the forest. So I've asked a bunch of people this question before, and it seems pretty complicated.
Yes, it's certainly very complicated. Biodiversity monitoring is definitely not my specialization, but definitely our partners would be the ones to ask. So if you wanted to do any follow-up, then you could look at, as I mentioned, BirdLife International, IUCN, and some other providers of data that we have on our site.
All right, so it sounds like you probably need to put a whole bunch of things together. You need to use the remote sensing data, you need to use the density of greenery, the canopy cover, maybe even some audio. I know some people measure ecosystems through sound, like they can hear like the bird life, and then through monitoring, and then you put it kind of all together like a jigsaw to get a sense of the true ecological diversity of an area. Claudia has a question too. Claudia, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Katie. I was wondering how you made this whole thing happen. It's so many pieces, right? And it's really impressive. And how did you create the partnerships, attract the funding? How long did it take? And so people can learn from that, because it's really excellent. Thank you.
So I can talk kind of more broadly, but Alice, please step in if you have any additional details on this. So like any larger projects, we started pretty small. I believe Global Forest Watch was conceived in 1997, and it was initially a network of NGOs that were interested in forests and interested in creating reports about forests. And it was piloted in Cameroon, Canada, Gabon, and Indonesia. And so initially, as I was saying, it's very, very small scale. But then as it gained momentum, we started branching out to other areas. So like Chile, Russia, Venezuela, Indonesia, and more. And so this was mostly in the stage of publishing reports. So we didn't really have any of these maps available yet, but we were kind of in the partnership building phase and the data gathering phase that really helped build a foundation for the tech that we would develop later. And then in 2004, we worked with governments in Central Africa and in other regions to create our first interactive online maps. These are known as the forest atlases, and they are still around and very active today. And they helped the specific Ministry of Environment and Forests in specific countries take responsibility for monitoring their country. So they would combine tree data with our deforestation data to produce maps to understand better the forest dynamics that are in their country. And then as technology improved, we're able to start building up these maps that you see today in the frameworks for doing analyses and visualization. So I think that we were lucky because we benefited from a really strong network of researchers to begin with. And then we were also able to get a lot of buy-in from the people who were using our data. And this really helped us kind of expand to different areas and then become more of a global resource than before.
Yeah, just to add one thing to that, I think one thing that's let us really progress in this space is the network that Kai mentioned. That includes people from many different industries and many different geographic regions. We're able to kind of take in their insight about their context and how they're interacting with the platform and the data to feed that into how we're designing the tool and designing how we're showing the data sets to make it really useful for them. And I think that's one thing that's also allowed us to be really successful because we're taking that kind of collaborative approach to designing these tools.
I think what was really interesting in Claudia's question in how Global Forest Watch has been established is that it is created by this big network of not-for-profits and organizations. It's not just one person's idea for a startup or one particular not-for-profit that just stands alone by itself trying to do everything, from what I can tell from the outside anyway. That it's really to make some software that's this good, that does so much, it seems to have taken a vast web of many groups coming together in quite a novel type of structure, right? I haven't seen that many other projects that seem to have so many different groups all feeding in and supporting and funding something like this. Is that sort of how it is from the inside?
I think so, because we partner with so many different organizations to build upon and innovate with the data. And then we have external partners working with us to kind of visualize that data. So we work with developers from Visuality as well as other kind of places to get it on our platform. But then when looking at it from the perspective of the data in action, we're not the ones going to the ground and investigating what's happening and reporting on what's happening and submitting those reports to government and agencies and things like that. That's really our network of partners who are doing that on the ground work, investigating the data. We really just serve as the platform that visualizes the data, pulls out some insights from a global perspective, and tries to make it as accessible as possible.
And does anyone pay for the service, like as a user? Like, are there any organizations that pay like a fee, or is it just completely just free and open to whoever wants to use it?
It's completely free and open to anyone who wants to use it. We really are striving to achieve what I think we've termed as radical transparency around the state of the world's forests.
My book on all my work is all about the theory of exactly what you said, radical transparency. Just put the data out there, get everyone to see it, and then you're halfway there once you can get the numbers out in a way that's really well designed in a good visual way for people to see it. I had one question that I wanted to user interaction. About user interaction design. So the usability, the UI is really nice. And there's a bunch of people in this group that are UI designers. I'm a UI designer. What do you think is your, like, would you call it secret sauce or special ingredient or something you do to make the UI that nice? Because like, honestly, like a lot of people try to do environmental software and it can be very terrible. Like nobody's putting any attention to detail. It's not very nice to use. It's slow to load. It's like, what's the secret to making it as nice as it is to use?
I can talk from my perspective, and then Kai, if you want to pop in with anything you want to add. From my perspective, which is really engagement and communications, I think the secret sauce is doing user testing and doing user testing with a broad group of people who will be end users of the platform, and that we know are end users of the platform, so that we have that diverse perspective when we're designing or visualizing a new data set or designing a new tool or something like that. Having really kind of diverse groups that we know are using our tools, informing how we're creating that is really, really important, from how we write things to the colors we use, like Kai mentioned in our presentation, to a range of other visualization tactics. Kai, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can attribute a lot of our design success to the partners that we work with at Visuality, for example. But one thing that we do a lot are user testing sessions and kind of A/B tests for certain parts of our site. So there are a lot of different ways that we interact with users and get their feedback through like surveys and then different tests that we can use to assess the popularity of new features, things like that. So we do spend a lot of time doing that kind of research, and we do factor in a lot of feedback that we get about it, because our site is for our users. We're trying to make it as simple and as easy to use for our kind of huge range of people. So we really value their direct feedback.
And so what does that mean though? Like when I do user testing, I basically do a Zoom call and a screen share. So the person's usually never seen it before, and I ask them to do a stream of consciousness. And in theory, I like these things to be 20 minutes, but they usually often go for 90 minutes, because not only are we talking about, oh, I like that button, make that font a bit bigger, I couldn't quite work out what that meant, but people are talking about their whole like kind of like emotional reaction to it, and in the context of their feelings about sustainability in the world and climate change. And so it actually ends up getting like pretty deep. Do you do like a certain number of these type of like more like deep interviews where you're spending quite a bit of time with users and they're just doing a screen share and they're clicking around?
Absolutely. So I've sit in on and led a lot of these user testing sessions, and the most recent round of them that I did was a couple months ago, and these we scheduled for 2.5 hours, but would sometimes go even longer than that if the person was willing to do it and really had a lot of things to say. And so it is exactly what you said, like really getting their initial emotions about the features that we're showing them, but then also asking them what they feel like the possibilities are for our tools. So kind of putting it in their hands to talk about, well, I like this feature, but like, what if it did this and this and this? And like, could you implement this? And so really giving them like creative freedom to talk about what they'd like to see in the future. And then these kinds of user testing sessions we can then implement to try to prioritize where our funding goes for the next round of software development and more. Yeah.
Right. How many of these sessions do you think you've led?
Oh, geez. So I think within this year, I've led 11 of them.
Is that 11 individual people, like 11 in meetings?
Well, or 11 kind of individual organizations. So it would be like one person, but sometimes we'd have like a couple people join if it was like an organization that had like 2 technical leads or like 2 people who were interested in joining.
I think it's worth just extrapolating the process, because I think building really good software requires just a really deeply empathetic dive into the user experience. And like you said, taking the time, scheduling 2.5 hours or more. And it's people think that they can do it perhaps just with like a survey or looking at data, or they're just like, or just give me 15 minutes of feedback. People ask me, with people who work on apps all the time, and they email me or message me and they say, oh, Katie, could I just get 15 minutes of feedback from you? And I'm like, listen, I just don't do 15 minutes of feedback. I'm like, schedule an hour and a half, and that's how long it's going to take. And it's so qualitative and so nuanced to make something really, really beautiful. And I think if people think that they can just like whack something up and code a prototype and not go through that process, I think they're not really understanding kind of what it takes. So I think it's really interesting to hear your journey in creating that.
Definitely.
Yeah,
go ahead, Alice.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, like I mentioned, we also complement those kind of user testing sessions with things like surveys. So we do a lot of surveys to try to assess who's using our tools, how are they using the tools, what gaps might there be, things like that. And from those surveys, we're able to get some more quantitative information by discerning like what patterns are there by people's responses. But we're also able to attain more contacts for that kind of user testing from people who we might not know are using our tools. And another tactic we use is we have a team dedicated to engagement with these kind of users. And they often are in conversation with them and learning about what are they doing, what are the challenges they're facing, what kind of issues are they having, and we can feed that back into our product development as well.
Okay, we're a little bit over time now. So just one last question is, since working on all this data, how are you feeling about the future of forest? Are you feeling optimistic? Are we making progress? Are you every day do you get up and get more and more worried? What's the outlook for the next 100 years of forests looking like?
I can take that question. So, personally, I do wake up worried, but that's kind of what I find motivating, because we are helping to empower people around the world to stop what can be really demotivating, which is huge trends, increasing trends in forest loss. And it's really hard to say what's going to happen in the next 100 years, but our general stance at the World Resources Institute is that in the next 10 years, so by about 2030, large-scale forest loss and degradation will have been consigned to the history books, and a substantial share of the world's lost and degraded forests will be under recovery. And we do have a team dedicated to restoration as well as this monitoring and protection work that we do.
So you think so what you're saying is that we've more or less come to the end, the world has finished the massive destruction. We've been had 100 years of massive forest destruction, which is now coming to an end, and we're kind of like turning the corner, and some restoration is starting to happen.
So I think it's hard to say exactly what's happening and if we're coming to an end, but I think our hope is that we are turning that corner and we are going into a phase that is focused on recovery and better protection. And I think we can kind of see some signs of that through the commitments that are coming out from different companies and countries, as well as through the huge kind of restoration movement that's been happening over the last year and a half or so.
So do you see enough good signs that give you hope? You see enough seeds of hope, literal seeds as well, literal seeds of forests?
I like to be optimistic. So I am hopeful that there are enough seeds of hope to get us to that better place. But I do think that society as a whole generally needs to really step up in order for us to really get there. I'm curious to hear Kai's perspective as well.
Yes, so I agree. I try to remain optimistic, and I am seeing some really amazing projects come out of our restoration team. They are working on a lot of projects about how to connect growers in the field and how to connect people who are working in these areas of deforestation with resources to reforest. And I think that's really great. And I think it's really cool how they're harnessing technology to do this. I kind of disagree with what you were saying about we're kind of at this turning point where things will continue improving and we'll see kind of downward trends in deforestation. I think the future holds a lot of uncertainty, especially with these kind of global events like COVID, for example, and other things that kind of take away priority from forests and other environmental topics. And so what is encouraging is that a lot of governments and kind of non-governmental organizations around the world are prioritizing climate and forestry issues. And I think that's great. But I do hope that the momentum is maintained even when there are kind of these global crises that are happening concurrently.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've actually been I've been helping the United Nations design their certification of restoration in engagement. So it's been really wonderful to learn about this big restoration movement that's been happening and to play a little part with them working on it. So I'm really hopeful to see what this restoration movement does with all these different organizations, and if it can kind of take hold in the hearts and minds of many millions of people around the world. So we've got 9 minutes over time. So everyone's been very patient and been here for a long time. Thank you so much, Alice and Kai, for joining us and being so generous with your time and sharing all the fascinating work that you are doing. And thank you for everybody who's still here on the call. We will wrap it up and edit it into a podcast in coming months. And if there's anything I can do to help share your work or support the organizations in any way, I'd love to do that. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. It was great to join you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us, Katie. And if anyone's interested in learning more about Global Forest Watch and what we do or accessing our tools, you can just go to globalforestwatch.org and they'll be there.